Section 7 of Invisible Links. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Invisible Links by Selma LagerlÃ. Translated by Pauline Bancroft Flack. The King's Grave, Part 2. The great compassionate forest spread over the wilderness. Concealing and protecting, it took to its heart everything which sought its help. With its lofty trunks it kept watch by the lair of the fox and the bear, and in the twilight of the thick bushes it hid the egg-filled nests of little birds. At the time when people still had slaves, many of them escaped to the woods and found shelter behind its green walls. It became a great prison for them which they did not dare to leave. The forest held its prisoners in strict discipline. It forced the dull ones to use their wits, and educated those ruined by slavery to order and honor. Only to the industrious did it give the right to live. The two who met on the heath were descendants of such prisoners of the forest. They sometimes went down to the inhabited, cultivated valleys, for they no longer feared to be reduced to the slavery from which their forefathers had fled. But they were happiest in the dimness of the forest. The hunter's name was Tönne. His real work was to cultivate the earth, but he also could do other things. He collected herbs, boiled tar, dried punk, and often went hunting. The dancer was called Jofrid. Her father was a charcoal burner. She tied brooms, picked juniper berries, and brewed ale of the white flowering myrtle. They were both very poor. They had never met before in the big wood, but now they thought that all its paths wound into a net, in which they ran forward and back and could not possibly escape one another. They never knew how to choose a way where they did not meet. Tönne had once had a great sorrow. He had lived with his mother for a long while in a miserable wattled hut. But as soon as he was grown up, he was seized with the idea to build her a warm cabin. During all his leisure moments, he went into the clearing, cut down trees and hewed them into squared pieces. Then he hid the timber in dark crannies under moss and branches. It was his intention that his mother should not know anything of all this work before he was ready to build the house. But his mother died before he could show her what he had collected, before he had time to tell her what he had wished to do. He who had worked with the same zeal as David, king of Israel, when he gathered treasures for the temple of God, grieved most bitterly over it. He lost all interest in the building. For him the brushwood shelter was good enough, yet he was hardly better off in his home than an animal in its hole. When he who had always heretofore crept about alone was now seized with a desire to seek Jofrid's company, it certainly meant that he would like to have her for his sweetheart and his bride. Jofrid also waited daily for him to speak to her father or to herself about the matter. But Tönne could not. This showed that he was of a race of slaves. The thoughts that came into his head moved as slowly as the sun when he travels across the sky. And it was more difficult for him to shape those thoughts to connected speech than for a smith to forge a bracelet out of rolling grains of sand. One day Tönne took Jofrid to one of the clefts where he had hidden his timber. He pulled aside the branches and moss and showed her the squared beams. "That was to have been mother's house," he said. The young girl was strangely slow in understanding a young man's thoughts. When he showed her his mother's logs, she ought to have understood, but she did not understand. Then he decided to make his meaning even plainer. A few days later he began to drag the logs up to the place between the cairns, where he had seen Jofrid for the first time. She came as usual along the path and saw him at work. Nevertheless, she went on without saying anything. Since they had become friends, she had often given him a good handshake, but she did not seem to want to help him with the heavy work. Tönne still thought that she ought to have understood that it was now her house which she meant to build. She understood it very well, but she had no desire to give herself to such a man as Tönne. She wished to have a strong and healthy husband. She thought it would be a poor livelihood to marry anyone who was weak and dull. Still, there was much which drew her to that silent, shy man. She thought how hard he had worked to gladden his mother and had not enjoyed the happiness of being ready in time. She could weep for his sake, and now he was building the house just where he had seen her dance. He had a good heart, and that interested her and fixed her thoughts on him, but she did not at all wish to marry him. Every day she went over the heather field and saw the log cabin grow, miserable and without windows, with the sunlight filtering in through the leaky walls. Tönne's work progressed very quickly, but not with care. His timbers were not bent square, the bark was scarcely taken off. He laid the floor with split young trees. It was uneven and shaky. The heather which grew and blossomed under it, for a year had passed since the day when Tönne had lain asleep behind King Atle's pile, pushed up old red clusters through the cracks, and ants without number wandered out and in, inspecting the fragile work of man. Wherever Jofrid went during those days, the thought never left her that a house was being built for her there. A home was being prepared for her upon the heath, and she knew that if she did not enter there as mistress, the bear and the fox would make it their home. For she knew Tönne well enough to understand that if he found he had worked in vain, he would never move into the new house. He would weep, poor man, when he heard that she would not live there. It would be a new sorrow for him, as deep as when his mother died. But he had himself to blame, because he had not asked her in time. She thought that she gave him a sufficient hint in not helping him with the house. She often felt impelled to do so. Every time she saw any soft white moss, she wanted to pick it to fill in the leaky walls. She longed, too, to help Tönne to build the chimney. As he was making it, all the smoke would gather in the house. But it did not matter how it was. No food would ever be cooked there, no ale brewed. Still, it was odious that the house would never leave her thoughts. Tönne worked glowing with eagerness, certain that Jofrid would understand his meaning if only the house were ready. He did not wonder much about her. He had enough to do to hew and shape. The days went quickly for him. One afternoon when Jofrid came over the moor, she saw that there was a door in the cottage and a slab of stone for a threshold. Then she understood that everything must now be ready, and she was much agitated. Tönne had covered the roof with tufts of flowering heather, and she was seized by an intense longing to enter under that red roof. He was not at the new house, and she decided to go in. The house was built for her. It was her home. It was not possible to resist the desire to see it. Within, it was more attractive than she had expected. Rushes were strewed over the floor. It was full of the fresh fragrance of pine and resin. The sunshine that played through the windows and cracks made bands of light through the air. It looked as if she had been expected. In the crannies of the wall green branches were stuck, and in the fireplace stood a newly cut fir tree. Tönne had not moved in his old furniture. There was nothing but new table and a bench over which an elk skin was thrown. As soon as Jofrid had crossed the threshold, she felt the pleasant coziness of home surrounding her. She was happy and content while she stood there, but to leave it seemed to her as hard as to go away and serve strangers. It happened that Jofrid had expended much hard work in procuring a kind dower for herself. With skillful hands she had woven bright colored fabrics, such as are used to adorn a room, and she wanted to put them up in her own home, when she got one. Now she wondered how these cloths would look here. She wished she could try them in the new house. She hurried quickly home, fetched her roll of weavings and began to fasten the bright colored pieces of cloth up under the roof. She threw open the door to let the big setting sun shine on her and her work. She moved eagerly about the cottage, brisk, gay, bumming a merry tune. She was perfectly happy. It looked so fine. The woven roses and stars shone as never before. While she worked, she kept a good lookout over the moor and the graves, for it seemed to her as if Tönne might now too be lying hidden behind one of the cairns and laughing at her. The king's grave lay opposite the door, and behind it she saw the sun setting. Time after time she looked out. She felt as if someone was sitting there and watching her. Just as the sun was so low that only a few blood-red beams filtered over the old stone heap, she saw who it was who was watching her. The whole pile of stones was no longer stones, but a mighty old warrior who was sitting there, scared and gray, and staring at her. Round about his head the rays of the sun made a crown, and his red mantle was so wide that it spread over the whole moor. His head was big and heavy, his face gray as stone. His clothes and weapons were also stone colored and repeated so exactly the shadings and mossiness of the rock, that one had to look closely to see that it was a warrior and not a pile of stones. It was like those insects which resemble tree twigs. One can go by them 20 times before one sees that it is a soft animal body one has taken for hard wood. But Jofrid could no longer be mistaken. It was the old King Atle himself sitting there. She stood in the doorway, shaded her eyes with her hand, and looked right into his stony face. He had very small, oblique eyes under a dome-like brow, a broad nose, and a long beard. And he was alive, that man of stone. He smiled and winked at her. She was afraid, and what terrified her most of all were his thick, muscular arms and hairy hands. The longer she looked at him, the broader grew his smile, and at last he lifted one of his mighty arms to beckon her to him. Then Jofrid took flight towards home. But when Tönne came home and saw the house adorned with starry weavings, he found courage to send a friend to Jofrid's father. The latter asked Jofrid what she thought about it, and she gave her consent. She was well pleased with the way it had turned out, even if she had been half forced to give her hand. She could not say no to the man to whose house she had already carried her dower. Still she looked first to see that old King Atle had again become a pile of stones. End of part 2 of The King's Grave, from Invisible Links by Selma Lagerlöf. Translated by Pauline Bancroft Flack. Read by Lars Rolander.